A big decision ahead for Sound Transit about light rail in West Seattle. Many neighbors don't like the idea of voter-approved elevated tracks up to 15 stories tall tearing up their neighborhood. But tunneling would add hundreds of millions of dollars to the project's cost.
Why would we take 99, a smaller version of the viaduct, and build it right through the core of a community?
It's hard for me to see where the money comes from for a tunnel.
Critics say paying for a tunnel would take money away from more urgent transportation priorities. And Sound Transit says tunneling could delay the opening of light rail in West Seattle.
Because tunnels typically take longer to construct.
What impact will neighborhood concerns have on a project nearing a major environmental review?
Doing it right is important.
Our studio panel weighs in.
What is equitable for West Seattle?
Don't delay it further.
A heavy conversation about light rail, next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Can you dig it? That's the question some West Seattleites have who want to bring light rail to their neighborhood with the use of tunneling. There's just one problem. A tunnel option would cost at least $700 million more than what Sound Transit has to spend. Plus, tunneling tends to be more complicated and could take more time to build in a region feeling the crunch of congestion growing every day. But advocates say a tunnel is the best way to protect homes and businesses in West Seattle, a neighborhood where Sound Transit is literally breaking new ground for the future of light rail. Finding a new way for commuters to get in and out of West Seattle via Sound Transit's Link Light Rail has been a dream years in the making.
The community is extremely excited about light rail.
But that excitement for West Seattle Junction Association Executive Director Lora Radford and other neighbors has taken a turn. Since 2016, when our region approved a $54 billion ST3 package, which includes light rail expansions to Ballard and West Seattle, Sound Transit has been working on where trains and tracks would actually go.
Next stop.
Over the past year, stakeholder groups and elected officials have narrowed down three options in West Seattle. Two of them, the voter-approved red and the proposed alternative yellow, involve elevated tracks as high as 150 feet in some locations, going south of the West Seattle Bridge, into Delridge, up to Avalon, and into the Junction at Alaska and California.
The size and the immensity of an elevated rail was something that I don't think we would have voted on if we had a visual representation.
The elevated options would displace as many as 160 residences and 35,000 square feet of business space, which is why some West Seattleites are pushing for a tunnel.
Why would we take 99, a smaller version of the viaduct, and build it right through the core of a community?
The tunnel option now on the table is the Blue Line that would travel north of the West Seattle Bridge, displacing closer to 70 homes and 15,000 square feet of business space. It would remain elevated through Delridge, but go underground for the Avalon and Junction stations. The problem? The Port of Seattle says the north of the bridge concept could present significant challenges to the maritime industry. Also, the estimated cost of the Blue Line would be $700 million more than what Sound Transit has budgeted, based on the voter-approved ST3.
The Purple Line, I think, is the option.
Plus, some elected leaders, like Seattle City Council member Lisa Herbold, are trying to revive the Purple option, which would cross the Duwamish River further to the south, involve a longer tunnel, but would be least disruptive to homes and businesses.
Both the community and the elected officials that represent that community have eyes that are bigger than their stomachs.
A group of elected leaders did not recommend the Purple Line for further study last year amid concerns about displacing high-voltage lines in Soto and digging through unstable soils in West Seattle's Pigeon Point neighborhood, both of which would add another $1.2 billion to the cost.
More study of the Purple Line further inform solid estimates.
But that hasn't stopped King County Council member Joe McDermott and Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkin from considering new ways to add to Sound Transit funding and supporting the purple option.
I think we owe it to our community to make sure that we study what we need to study.
Looking for funding for a tunnel in West Seattle it's misguided.
Ryan Packer is a senior editor for The Urbanist, who says when local leaders are talking about adding funding for light rail tunnels in West Seattle, the whole city should be listening.
West Seattle would probably prefer a tunnel, and I think most people would prefer that too, but once it becomes a citywide conversation about directing funds, then it's really hard to get on board with that.
It's going to be third and fourth and fifth party funding that is going to be necessary to make it happen.
Councilmember Herbold has vowed to find other revenue, perhaps using city transportation tax dollars, or canceling the proposed First Avenue streetcar, or even asking the Port of Seattle for help.
It's hard for me to see where the money comes from for a tunnel.
But Packer says any additional transportation money should go to the city's billion-dollar maintenance backlog, unfunded Move Seattle levy mandates, or future extensions of light rail.
When you start saying what else could we do with that third, fourth, and fifth party funding that we're talking about, with the pressing needs that Seattle has, tunnel in West Seattle just drops to the bottom of that list.
That's not the only concern about tunneling.
We'd have to be prepared for the possibility, if we do pursue something different than elevated structure, that it could take longer.
Cahill Ridge is Sound Transit's Central Corridor Director, steering the Ballard and West Seattle Link extensions through hundreds of public meetings since the passage of ST3.
It's been a tremendous amount of work.
The plan was to get light rail into West Seattle by the year 2030, but tunneling could delay that.
We're not making any final decisions at this point.
And while Sound Transit says it's still early in the process, there's an important decision coming up at the end of May, in which the Sound Transit Board will decide which options are studied in the environmental impact statement process.
If we can get that input early and identify what we should study, what people are interested in studying, and evaluate it in the EIS, we can then present to folks a very robust analysis of the trade-offs between alternatives, and that would then inform what we should ultimately build.
The dream of light rail in West Seattle that once seemed very far away is speeding ever closer, as battle lines between tunnel advocates digging in to preserve their neighborhood and transportation advocates warning about higher costs and delays are now clearly drawn.
Isn't it better to delay for another couple more years and get it right than build another 99 through West Seattle?
And I think everyone can get on the same page that we shouldn't delay the project.
There's a long way to go, but we've made quite a lot of progress this year, hopefully.
We have a lot to discuss here when it comes to light rail in West Seattle and beyond. We have an esteemed panel to help us out with that, including Willard Brown. He serves on the Stakeholders Advisory Group for the West Seattle Light Rail Project. Willard, good to have you.
Thank you.
We also have with us Councilmember Mike O'Brien, Transportation Chair of the Seattle City Council, and also co-chair of the elected leaders group within this body. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian.
And we have with us Keith Kyle. He is Executive Director of Seattle Subway at Transit Advocacy Group. Keith, good to see you again.
Thank you.
And here we go. We're taping the show just after a Stakeholders Advisory Group meeting, Willard, that you attended. And I want to start with you. What was decided at that meeting? There was some mixing and matching going on. Help us with that overall recommendation, if you can, about the West Seattle Light Rail Project.
I'd be glad to. The meeting last night was our final meeting as a group. What we were charged with was taking a look at the crossing north or south of the bridge, taking a look at the various line alignments with regard to each segment and whether or not the elevated or tunnel and station locations would be recommended. And so we did that directly on each of the various segments of the alignment.
Okay, and we're going to get into some of those details in just a minute here, but thank you for breaking those pieces down with me. Mike, I think you're going to be referee a little bit today. I'm going to skip past you real quick and jump over to Keith if I could here. Keith, your thoughts about what stakeholders are looking at here, and this elevated versus tunnel piece I know is something that's very important.
Sure. Given unlimited funding, absolutely people are going to choose a tunnel. It has less impacts. Ultimately, when it's done, you don't have to look at it. That's all understood. The issue really is about money and time. So, and those two things can be a factor of each other. Yeah. So, if we were to raise the budget of the West Seattle Rail by almost 50%, that's going to have a pretty significant impact. And there's not really a plausible funding source to pay for that when, as Ryan said in the lead-in video, there's all the other transit priorities that we have in the city, if you weigh that one against those, including extending the line further south,
right.
It's hard to find that we would locally fund that. So I think our biggest issue for this is we want to make sure that elevated options move forward that are acceptable and can move forward if funding does not come through.
Got it. I know that is part of it, and we'll get back to that in just a second. Mike, before we really crack into what the stakeholders are asking for, I want to ask about the timeline ahead. I know the Elected Leaders Group has a meeting coming up end of April. Then the Sound Transit Board, May 23rd, will be figuring out these options that would be studied in the environmental impact statement. I know we are early in this process, but just how fluid is the situation? How important is that date of May 23rd?
Well, it's really important that we keep this process moving so we can stick to the timeline. I mean, West Seattle, we've committed to getting light rail there by 2030, Ballard 2035. Those numbers are really far out there for a lot of folks, and we don't want them to get any further out. Now, this whole process was set up by Sound Transit because they wanted to figure out how they can streamline the process and maybe even save some money to narrow down the scope of what we're doing. And for the most part, it's been really successful. In South Lake Union and Inner Bay and Ballard, downtown, we've really taken a lot of the options off the table and focused on some. And there are a couple of neighborhoods, West Seattle and the Chinatown International District, where some challenges remain. And what will likely have to happen is we'll carry multiple options through the environmental review where we can learn more about costs and design implications. And that still sets us ahead of schedule for the broader project, but we have to stay on time to keep these things moving.
Got it. And Willard, let's try to break down just an overview as best you can of some of the different elements that you were recommending as a stakeholders group.
So we had two charges. One, a recommendation based on if we had additional funding, and secondly, a recommendation if there was no additional funding coming forward. So just sticking with West Seattle, I think it's important to understand that our group was looking at what would economically makes sense if there was no additional funding. And so with the recommendation coming out of the SAG is that you would cross south of the
West Seattle Bridge.
You would come in through Pigeon Point and go on around, come just past Genesee, and then put a station in the blue line station survives this scrutiny, and then you would forego a station in Avalon and go to the Junction and tunnel, put a station in a tunnel under 41st or 42nd.
Okay, got it.
So that is the recommendation if there's no additional funding. By giving up the station at Avalon, it is hoped that it comes close to offsetting the cost of the tunnel.
Got it.
And in the Junction.
Thank you for simplifying that, because I know there's a lot more to it than that. Kyle, I just think about this, and I think one of these trade-offs in West Seattle is finding ways to minimize the impact of a light rail project that's relatively unique in the Sound. I'm thinking about it's carving through retail, it's going through neighborhoods, it's going into a downtown core area. It involves some seriously steep slopes here. I'm just thinking about these different options, and does tunneling make sense to you, I guess, in looking at that, just because of the uniqueness of this?
Well, I mean, I think there's some sense to that option that was just put on the table just now. The one thing about that is we were always under the impression it wasn't possible to remove a station because the voters approved 3 stations in West Seattle. So one of the things that I was going to talk about today was we want to see a lot of different options that do not cost more money make it through, because we think that it's worth looking at multiple options there, whereas tunneling, I think it may be easier to come to a consensus as to which tunnel option makes the most sense at this point. I think, talking about a $1.2 billion tunnel still making it through probably doesn't make sense.
Okay, that's that purple option.
Yeah, it's that purple option. Whereas it seems like there's a pretty decent consensus about which tunnel option should make it through.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I think certainly a cut and cover kind of station around 41st, that makes a lot of sense. But the issue with doing that is it decreases the bus connectivity, decreases the chances for TOD. Having a station, for instance, on Delridge, it'd be direct transfers coming off of one of the busiest buses in Seattle, the 120. You're talking about a total redesign of the bus network in West Seattle after West Seattle Light Rail is in, which also opens up options for buses coming from Avalon, coming up 35th. So it's a really broad options that you can do if you have 3 stations that you take away with 2.
Right. And Mike, maybe I can have you weigh in here. This idea of taking out the Avalon piece, your thoughts about that? What would Sound Transit as a group say about that? The board, what do you think?
I mean, Keith raised the issue about some legal challenges about doing something like that, but that's for us to figure out going forward. And I think the stakeholder advisory groups trying to be creative and prioritizing and saying we think the less disruption to the core of the business district is more important than the station. Those are the opinions we want to hear as we're evaluating this. And so, I'm not exactly sure what the board will do with that in a month, but I think the elected leadership group will take that seriously and look at a couple options there and try to carry the most pragmatic and reasonable ones that address as many concerns as possible for it.
Got it. Thanks. And Willard, just in staying with you here, in tackling that money question, I know we're not there yet, but there have to be some talks about that. If there's any sort of tunnel here that would involve some extra dollars, is there a source of revenue that would be a good fit for this project? Has that been talked about? How do you justify that? Help me out with that, please.
No. Well, 2 things. One, for the Stakeholder Advisory Group, we were instructed from the very beginning that we could not make our decisions based on cost.
I see.
So funding for the project was something that we were supposed to disregard.
Yep.
And just look at the best alignment, look at the constituents and the input from all of the stakeholders that we all represent, and what those positions were and what those preferences were. And so that's what we pieced together and presented. And for the Stakeholder Advisory Group, we did that from the start to all the way along the entire alignment for each and every organization and the representative on the SAG. So we did that. And so and by doing that, what we have is some areas of consensus that are amazing as far as I'm concerned. So I will leave it there. It's the big question is, you talk about the West Seattle link, and we all know that when you do 4th or 5th Avenue, that those numbers are going to dwarf anything that we do in West Seattle. So we think it's an equity issue. And we're going to hold the city accountable as part of this race and equity agenda to say what is equitable for West Seattle. Relatively speaking, we've had much less investment in our infrastructure as other parts of the city, and it's time that we had some kind of benefit from some public project that would benefit the city.
All right.
And not just West Seattle, but the entire city.
Well, he started. Let's talk about this equity issue.
I'd like to challenge that a little bit. There is a highway that goes to West Seattle that the city invested in. So in terms of the junction, I think that the line doesn't end at the junction. It's a big equity issue about our ability to expand further south. So if you're going to spend a lot of money on a feature for this line that could be spent on anything in Seattle, we would rather see that money go to extending further south and reaching more transit-dependent neighborhoods to the south of the junction.
White Center is another piece of it that's been talked about too.
And in that price range, you could almost build that whole line.
Well, and Mike, let me jump on this because I know you've been hearing this equity issue for some time here. Your thoughts about that, I guess just with regard to what Willard was saying.
Well, start with the reality that we have so many communities that really want transit in their neighborhood. And so that's a good challenge to have. I mean, we're no longer talking about expanding freeways. And Willard's absolutely right. There are communities that have been underinvested in. I would say, from my perspective, probably less so the junction than further south there. And we need to get there, as Keith said. But doing it right is important. And so I think let's look at the tunnel options. Let's figure out how we can streamline those. Let's, adding $1 billion to the project is probably going to be, too much for us to handle. But let's keep a few things in the mix that we can consider moving forward as we learn more. The federal funding situation right now is really up in the air with this federal administration, but maybe that changes in a couple years and we have a little more flexibility. So let's carry some of that flexibility forward.
And we did ask the Port of Seattle specifically about this, Mike, if they'd be willing to pay for an option south of the bridge or something along those lines. They told us it is too early in the process to discuss funding while options are under consideration. I'm just trying to figure out what are the types of sources of revenue that could be considered here.
Well, all of us jurisdictions are trying to be non-committal.
Yeah.
You heard that from the port. I'll be the same from the city. The counties has a role in this. But at the end of the day, as we piece together a project that we think has broad consensus from citizens, that's a huge thing to do. I mean, if we have a project that neighborhoods are fighting against each other, businesses are fighting, we can just talk about adding a couple decades to this. So getting consensus is really huge. And then if the reality is that consensus means we're having to increase some revenue somewhere, we'll have to come together and figure that out. I don't have specifics, Brian, but some tools that we could use. You know, you heard someone mention the vehicle license fee. We're talking about transportation impact fees. You know, we could be going back to Olympia and asking for additional revenue sources. But it's important to remember that there's an opportunity cost to all these, because those funds could go to building out sidewalks or expanding light rail to White Center. And so we got to be really pragmatic about this, but there is some value in spending a little more to have broad consensus.
Thank you very much. Willard, I'll head back to you, and I'm just trying to figure out what this West Seattle project, in terms of how it's handled, how does that impact the rest of the Sound Transit system here? What will it do with Ballard, which is supposed to come online as part of this project a little bit later there? What do other cities in the Sound Transit universe say about this? What do you think about that?
Well, we need a regional system, and we all recognize that. And people should be able to travel to Everett, to Tacoma, the whole, and to the airport and the like. What I am most hopeful for is that the system will have station locations that are synonymous with the destinations and the main places that people want to actually get to, and therefore, you know, Seattle Center. The stadium. Okay, I mean, I know the Soto folks have their preferences, but it has to go to both damn stadiums.
right.
Okay.
All right, Willard said it here. Thank you. All right.
And the airport. And so how the system connects and having the ability to endure any kind of stalling or whatever means you have to have some repetitive system and flows. And so we've looked at all of that, and we've dealt with all of that, and we think that what we have come up with serves the planners well as the community.
Would West Seattle be willing to have that delay of a couple years to have the tunnel and a better looking project, I guess?
If it came to that, but I don't think it will. I think what we're planning, what we are recommending, I think, is something that can be studied and evaluated as part, from the beginning, as they move through the whole entire system. Because where we have consensus, you can start studying tomorrow, as far as I'm concerned. And where we do not have consensus, then you have to do the various options.
Okay, fair enough. Keith, your thoughts about this, the impact of this West Seattle microcosm on the larger system?
Sure. So there is expected schedule impacts of doing a tunnel for West Seattle. How much is a little unclear at this point, as you say. It has to be studied more. But then there's also financial kind of timeline impacts. One way you could pay for it is pushing it back even further. What we've heard from people over and over again is don't delay it further. So when people talk to us in person, or when we're doing online advocacy over and over again, that message is huge. Expand the system as fast as you can is huge. So that's kind of how we've approached this, and in terms of what the best options are to go forward with.
And Mike, just this whole concept of the timing of all this, I know that with this whole project here, there's been concerns about rising costs, certainly in Seattle. And I think what I've heard from a few people, the former Sound Transit Chair Dave Summers is one, of course, rising costs. If there's more debt, then it's Seattle's hook. Seattle's on the hook for something like that. Help me out with that piece in terms of, I guess, potential delays here, how you're looking at that, this overall system going forward.
There's a dance that's playing out regionally, and as Willard said, this has to be a regional system, and folks need to work together. And the Sound Transit Board's done a really amazing job over the past few years to really collaborate on this, and we all need to hold each other accountable. And so, if you're a taxpayer or a transit rider in Everett, and you feel like, hey, Seattle's taking more than their share, that doesn't seem fair. they need to raise those voices. At the same point, we're building a really expensive tunnel through downtown Seattle because people in Everett and Tacoma want to get to downtown Seattle where the jobs are. And so how you share those costs is something that we need to balance. But we have a starting point, the ballot initiative that people passed that laid out kind of where stations should be, what the alignments are going to be. And that's kind of the baseline that we'll work with. And so we'll be posturing a lot in the next few years about this, and we'll be pushing on each other. But at the end of the day, I have a lot of faith in elected leaders to come together and community members to come together and agree on a consensus package that we can get done.
Thanks very much for that. We need to start wrapping up the show. I really thank you for a good conversation here. Willard, final thoughts, final words to the Sound Transit Board. They're deciding about a month from the time we're taping the show what to study in this environmental impact statement. What do you want to tell them?
Keep moving forward, keep pushing forward. With the recommendations we made last night, I think they should look at studying all of the various options where there was no consensus. And I do believe that the EIS will yield a result that we can all get behind once they do that. But do not let cost be the only consideration, but make sure that it is a factor. And I want to be responsible about this, but I do think we need to make sure that the system in West Seattle is one that does not impact the community and look like Tukwila with a 170-foot elevated rail system throughout West. No one's going to want that, and so and that would feel a little bit like a betrayal to the people of West Seattle, and that's a huge constituency.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Final words of advice for the Sound Transit Board here.
Yeah, I think the concepts that they should have, front and center are making sure that whatever is selected is accessible as possible. That means to people on foot, to people arriving by bus, that it is expandable. Like I said before, West Seattle doesn't end at the Junction. We need to be thinking about future expansion, and that whatever choice they do is as reliable as possible. So making sure that we have a high quality option, because that is what people voted for. And so moving forward with that, and also in specifically West Seattle, let's put a lot of affordable options out there so that some of that conversation can happen after we have more information.
Thanks. Mike, final thoughts for the Sound Transit Board going forward here?
One, thanks Sound Transit for setting up this process, because I think it was a really productive process. We didn't solve everything, but we solved a lot. We couldn't do this work without advocates like Seattle Subway that are constantly coming up with creative ideas and challenging elected officials and bring a lot of expertise to it outside of an agency.
Sure.
And the Stakeholder Advisory Group, Willard, your team has done an amazing work over a year plus time to really, as you said, set up some options for us to consider and be really thoughtful. And so I think we're in a great spot. It's going to be a challenging month, but I feel confident we'll get through that. And we got years of planning work to do, and hopefully we can go fast so we can get these things delivered on time and on budget.
Okay, thank you all for your input here, and we will be right back.
It would be nice to have it done faster because our city is just getting so congested.
And certainly underground makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons, but obviously there are costs.
Even if it's more expensive, it saves the aesthetics of Seattle.
Anything to get the flow of traffic easier in and out of the city and less crowded, that's what I'm for.
We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook and Twitter and give us your feedback.
Before we close today, it's time for our weekly CIO poll. Which option do you support for light rail in West Seattle? The voter-approved elevated red line, the alternate elevated yellow line, the blue tunnel line, or something else? We want to know what you think. Cast your vote and weigh in with your comments at our website, seattlechanel.org/cityinsideout. While you're there, you can watch our programs online anytime. Coming up next week, a look at the future of Seattle journalism. As more people turn away from traditional media, how can news organizations reinvent themselves and sustain themselves financially? We're talking with some local innovators making their own headlines. Next time on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.